people are getting ready to draft, what's your first tip for them?
Know your rules. I mean, it's really the basics of fantasy sports, but particularly fantasy baseball. The number of players, the number of positions, the position eligibility, it makes a big difference, So when you're looking at things like categories, first of all, on base percentage or batting average, that makes a big difference. A bunch of players' values are going to shift tremendously. Is it a points league or is it Roto 5x5? Points league, stolen bases, they hardly even matter. Roto league, they're everything, right? So you really got to take a look at that, especially if you're a beginner. Study the rules, know them. Even people who are more advanced, you still got to know the rules. DL spots. Can you DL a guy? Really, if you can or cannot do a transaction like that and you just have reserve spots, it makes a big difference in the player pool of free agencies.
So if you do have extra IR spots, DL spots, you're more apt to draft players that maybe are going to miss the beginning of the season?
Yeah, I mean, especially like in leagues like that, you can draft somebody who's injured, slot them away for a month or something like that, and you're not going to get penalized in the meantime.
What's your second tip for people drafting soon?
Before you start the season, I would like to model the categories and positions, right? That's really what fantasy baseball is all about, especially if you're playing in a Roto league as opposed to a points league. There's a big need for speed again. Last year, there was the fewest steals in the league since 1971, only 2 players with 40-plus steals. You got to really look at the stolen bases and figure out and map that out, how you're going to attack that in your league. You got to look at the positions. Third base looks a little weak this year. So, getting a third baseman early in the draft can really pay dividends because it gets kind of thin pretty early. And saves, once again, saves has really changed over the last few years. I mean, there's, bullpens by committee. Nobody had over 40 saves last year for the first time since the early 80s.
A third of the steals are off the board in the first 100 picks. Why do you think steals are down overall over the last couple of years?
Well, it's just the kind of the sabermetrical revolution of, the risk reward of stealing usually is to not risk it. So, and then, we're also in the home run era. So, you just don't want to risk outs. And, maybe that'll change and maybe that'll happen. What it does, maybe that'll change and, steals will come back. But if you're going to stay in this environment, you got to figure out how you're going to get them, because the players who can contribute in both stolen bases and power and other categories are just so few and far between. They go in the first couple of rounds. If you miss one of those, you're really behind in the draft or an auction. And so, who are your late targets? How are you going to make up for that? That's one thing you just got to really study in a draft or auction format ahead of time. You got to have a plan for speed. I mean, it's the one thing to attack.
All right, what's your third tip for people drafting soon? What's a common mistake or something that they should look out for?
In baseball, more than almost any other fantasy sports, you really got to know the depth chart. I mean, the number one thing I do to study for a fantasy baseball draft is to just really go through the depth charts. And I'm not talking about who are the starters, but who are the closers in waiting? Who's the backup third baseman? Especially if you're in a deep league, it's important. Everybody in baseball has a chance to have an impact and get 100 plus at bats. 50, 100 innings, as a reliever. So all the players matter. You got to know the player pool cold. I mean, it's not just as easy as fantasy football where, maybe if the starters at the quarterback, wide receiver, running back, tight end. You got to go deep, especially if you're going to compete in a league that's anything more than like a shallow, 12-team mixed league.
If you're picking at the first overall pick, now with all the injuries, who are you taking in your drafts today?
I mean, there's really no consensus number one this year. I mean, Trey Turner's really appealing because of the speed. And Jose Ramirez is really appealing because of third base. Juan Soto is probably my pick. I just think he has the most upside. You don't necessarily need to take him number one, but if you're in a draft or an auction and the values are all probably even, I'd probably go with him.
The best way to get ready for your fantasy baseball draft is the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Draft Kit. Free for 10 days right now. Go get it for free. Go to rotowire.com/try.